Well, I was discussing Alien, the original Alien, last night with my friend Gerard. We've been talking about. It's one of those weird things. We've been talking about doing a series of discussions on the whole Alien franchise for almost
without me.
Well, no, you're more than welcome. You are more than welcome. I mean, in fact, what I did say to him is, you do realize there's going to be like multiple discussions on this franchise on the channel. Because I have to discuss it. I mean, Kit also wants to do one. So
yes, of course he does.
It's ubiquitous, right? And this, I mean, what we're discussing tonight is no different. I've actually already done a discussion on Candyman for What the Hell Is Wrong With Us with Kit. So
yes, I know, I've listened to it.
Any excuse, you know?
And you and I, George, have already done Alien 3, haven't we?
We have, yes. We have
Alien
indeed.
3.
By the way, I mentioned last night that Alien 3 is absolutely one of the best Alien films out there. And Gerard absolutely agrees. Absolutely agrees. So
good. It's good.
Got an
he's
enormous
properly
spot for that
calibrated
film.
then.
Yeah, he absolutely is. Although he also doesn't like Prometheus, Jack, so...
Yeah, this is interesting. I need to go back and rewatch it, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Like is exactly the word.
Is that too strong? Is that too strong a word?
I think there are things in it that I appreciated. Reading back my essay,
I can totally get behind that, because there are things about it I appreciate too. It's just overwhelmed by the things I don't.
Yeah, but Alien 3 is definitely, I would say, the second best film in the entire franchise.
Yeah,
definitely.
There's,
absolutely.
There's the first one is completely in a class by itself, and then Alien 3 is very, very definitely in second place, and then for me it's like everything else.
Just all mulched together.
Which I know is heresy, because you're supposed to worship at the altar of aliens, but
you are supposed to. Yes,
I don't. I'm afraid.
No, Alien is one of the
superficially entertaining, but that's about it.
As I said to Gerard last night, it's one of those texts that is just part of who I am. I can't even remember a time before it. It's so strange, and it's one of those films where every time, despite having seen, it's a childhood favorite, that is. So every time I come back to it, it does it for me. It's frightening. It's disturbing. It's just wonderful, despite knowing every inch of the damn film.
There's nothing wrong with rewatching things. I was really pleased that actually my partner said this to me, because she was very skeptical about the idea of, I don't understand how you rewatch things, I don't understand what you get out of it.
Oh my God.
And then she suddenly completely turned a corner on that. She said, I get it. I get it. And I was like, I said, it's quite hard to explain. I said, but
I'm finding that I'm doing it more as I get older, to be perfectly honest. I'm settling into routines. So, I mean, this time of year, which I think we discussed on one of these podcasts, for some reason, this time of year has a really almost like ritualistic element about it for me. There's loads coming up that I'm going to be rewatching. All of those M.R. James adaptations for the BBC, all of those are going to be rewatched. The Stone Tape, that's coming up. That's all ready to go.
Though, as we know, although people listening might not know, this was not a rewatch for me. I avoided this for decades,
since 1992.
And I had
How did you do that?
I had to really think back and trust that I wasn't editing my own memories as to why. Because I'm putting my cards on the table. I'm a very odd candidate for this podcast, because I've always been a wuss with horror, and yet
I was going to say, you don't like the graphic kind of extreme violent horror, really, do you?
I struggle. I've got no I've got no moral issues with it. It's simply, I'm a wuss. I'm a wuss. But I've always had a deep fascination with it. But it really is a peep into the abyss for me, because I am, as a kid and as a teenager and as an adult, I'm very easily traumatized.
So I was kind of worried for you about this one, knowing that you hadn't seen it before. I was thinking, oh my God, there are things in this that are going to really, really shake him up.
And yet, strangely, this is not to denigrate the film in any way, because I can report back that I really loved it. But no, it didn't. But that was, I think largely because I was so knocked out by things that were going on in it, in addition to the sheer viscera, that I thought it was such a rich thing that I actually went off to my bed with more than just imagery in my in knocking.
I think it's hard not to.
I was going to butt in to say that obviously this is a very gory film, and it kind of came home to me on this rewatch just how gory it is. But I've never thought of it that way. It's really in my mind. It's not a film that I have filed under sort of gory or violent, and it still isn't even after this rewatch where I was very aware of it.
I can understand
film,
that. Yeah,
it's very much like. Yeah, I mean, Alien. We were just talking about Alien. I feel the same way about that. Obviously, that is horrendously gory, particularly in certain points. But it's not a film that I have filed under that heading in my brain. I think of both those films in a similar way. I think of them both more as dreams. They're more dreamlike.
It is context, isn't it?
But it wasn't the gore that put me off in 1992. Well, actually, 1992, I would have been too young. It would have been as it came out onto video, VHS. I think what put, as I say, I had to sort of really think back and try not to edit my memories, because I did watch gory things. I mean, I watched Prince of Darkness when it was, and that's got a lot of gore and viscera in it. And there was an enormous amount of things that I watched at the time, which was inappropriate for my age, as we've discussed many times. But with this, I think what did it for me is it was able to work on a younger mind, so it was more successful than Blair Witch did. The mirror ritual really freaked me out, and I think it was in the trailer. And I think what I can remember is I remember there might have been a feature on it on a thing called The Movie Show, which was on like a mid-morning of a Saturday. And I think I remember catching a little rundown to it, like, this is coming into the cinema, in 2 weeks or whatever. And I remember, and it was all the trailer, or certainly the clips they were showing, were built around the mirror ritual as the key thing. And I thought, there's no way I can deal with that. And then over the years, because I started to remember things, I remember a friend of mine when I was a kid. So, sort of like maybe 93, 90. No, his
do the ritual.
His elder brother used to make him do it. He also used to come to his room in the middle of the night with a coat hanger and tap on as if it were a hook. And I remember hearing this back.
A putative psychopath going on there, isn't it? That's like worrying.
Yeah, they've buried the hook or the hatchet or the hook it. So I was like, there's no fucking way. Excuse me, podcasters. I'm right into the F-bombs already.
They're really used to the foul language already. So don't worry.
I was I don't know if I can. And then what happens? Years go by, decades go by, and it just dropped out of my consciousness, which is really odd considering it's Barker, and I've got a lot of love for Barker, and obviously this is from a short story originally, and is he an executive producer on this? I imagine he's
executive producer.
Yeah. So it just, over the many years, it just dropped out of my thinking until I think it was you who suggested this one when we were putting together this season.
Wasn't it? Yes.
And I was like, wow, I better get a hold of a copy, because I am clueless apart from a couple of images. And so it was a very interesting Saturday night.
I can well imagine. Well, it doesn't surprise me. I seem to remember
saying to you a couple of times that I would be stunned if you didn't love it.
You should have made a bet, my friend, because I would have had to pay you money.
It's so in our wheelhouse. It's so in our milieu in more ways than I initially realized, having rewatching it this time. I mean, the mythology of it, I mean, we'll get into it when we get into it, but it's so redolent of everything we've discussed before with regards to The Shining, with regards to The Witch, with regards to the Blair Witch Project. It's a very similar kind of mythology, isn't it? We talk all the time about these mythologies that are based in like wounds in history, that are hauntological, and that is this, right?
But I loved it. I loved. I mean, there are things we'll discuss, there are things that we'll unpack, and there are inevitably caveats to anything. But I loved it for its content, for what it was trying to underpin that content with, and I loved it for its aesthetic. And I didn't realise until after the credits rolled that it was Bernard Rose of Paper House fame.
Exactly.
And then it all made sense, because I thought, it's got that. It's got that thing that Paper House has got. And then, of course, my brain went, of course, this no doubt Bernard Rose was brought onto this, because this was probably going to be a British film first off.
Almost certainly.
And then, of course, I found out all that it was, and how the interesting history with Virginia Madsen's in it, then not in it, then back in it as another character. Right. And it's like, oh, wow, this is that. But I think actually the relocation, not only for commercial reasons, but I think it really is
thank God for that
an amazing move.
Because it changes the timbre of the story, doesn't it? It changes
And having been to Chicago, it was particularly resonant for me because I've been to Chicago and I've stayed on the outskirts of Chicago. I didn't stay in the middle. I didn't stay in this, and so seeing it in its 90s form and then sort of linking it back to when I was there, I thought it's a very, very interesting city. I mean, it's a very the atmosphere of Chicago is very different to, say, New York. It's a very interesting city, and this film, I mean, it was tangible. God, this really is Chicago. This is the Chicago I was in. He lifts it into film perfectly.
We've been in Chicago before in this series of podcasts, or on one of the offshoots anyway, George, because we of course talked about Poltergeist 3.
We did.
On our little offshoot about the Poltergeist movies, and that is set in Chicago. It's set in a skyscraper in Chicago, and that really and it's roughly the same sort of time period, late 80s, early 90s. So characters in the Chicago of Candyman would have been around and about the same city as Poltergeist 3 is happening, if you know what I mean. But Poltergeist 3, it's interesting that both those films, both horror films, both uncanny films, both set in Chicago, they both concentrate firstly on architecture. And they both concentrate enormously on mirrors.
So they do.
I mean, Chicago is, I think, an architecture nerd's dream. I mean, for me, if you're into modernist, brutalist, corporate, and it is just fascinating to. The best thing to do is get on a boat. And go down through and see the backs of the buildings. It's an extraordinary experience, and then it absolutely lifted into this. I mean, there's so much you could just say about Cabrini Green. Before you even get into the rest of
Jesus Christ. I mean, we could do a podcast about the history of Cabrini Green as a hauntological site, and it would just, this film aside, and it would fit into this series of podcasts.
Because it really struck me when I was watching, because I stayed in a hotel on the outskirts of town, and again, big flat, where all fauna is kind of decaying or absent, and the old Sears Tower in the distance, and it had that. It really struck a chord with me, because I thought, it was rather like being in that hotel where the old Sears Tower and the rest of Chicago as a hub seems to both loom over where you are and yet be nowhere near it. and Cabrini Green is that, and of course with the connotations in that, certainly in the sense of ghettoizing and so on. It's like out there on a limb, and yet under the shadow of the rest of the city at the same time. It is a very peculiar layout. It's a very peculiar, which his camera just feasts on. And the fact that you can't see, I mean, there's little patches of fauna, and that's kind of it. And then just those aerial shots, you have to keep reminding yourself, this is before drones. This is, you had to get in a chopper, and you had to keep the camera still somehow. And these, where the car and Bernardet and Helen, everything's so fragile looking. And I did notice actually that the opening, because again, sorry everybody, but this is the kind of thing I geek out about. The opening titles were lifted from Psycho. Same it's like, because those opening titles are so distinctive, and it's like, oh my god, they're using the Psycho opening titles, but with this kind of Dick Tracy aerial view of the city. I mean, fantastic! This is amazing.
Of course, against Philip Glass's score as well, which is it's one of the great horror movie scores, I think, personally, and it's so unique in the entire. The history of horror movie scores. I've never heard anything like it.
It's been I watched it a couple of days ago, and it's been going round and round in my head. Yes. The tunes have been going round and round my head, constantly.
Yeah. The title theme for me, it sticks in my mind. It sounds like chamber music, does it not? It evokes kind of like polite society chamber music.
Well, it's an extraordinary thing for him to get this film and look at it, and he is such a smart composer. He seems to tap into right away what this film is playing with in terms of class, in terms of all these things, and he's in this sort of stark Chicago of ghettoized neighborhoods and polite academic society. And he goes, yes, neo-Gothic chamber music. It's like, Jesus, yeah, that's it. That's brilliant.
Perfect. Absolutely perfect. I mean, what it reminds me of, it is in terms of the way it sounds, it doesn't sound anything like it. But in terms of what it does for the film, it reminds me of Chris Figg's soundtrack from the Hellraiser films.
Mm. In fact, the music box motif could easily work in Hellraiser.
Yes. It also brings in choral sounds, which is a risky thing for any film composer doing a horror soundtrack after The Omen to do, because it's inevitably going to bring back into people's minds The Omen, and it could sound like copying or pastiche and so on and so forth. But no, I mean, Philip Glass gets away with it beautifully, and he also brings in this fairy tale feeling. Certainly as you get into the film, the closing music is lush and melodic, and it feels like the music from a fairy tale.
But of course, because he's one of the architects
underscoring it,
because he's one of the architects of minimalist music in classical music, and we have this whole thing, the modernist architecture dominating Chicago, everything dovetails, and because his music is built on a cellular formation, it's very, he's a minimalist, that's what it is. So the idea of repeated cycles,
and also the idea of a beehive,
and the beehive, cellular, and it's like everything
goes on
dovetails. And for a story where the lead character, or one of the lead characters, is a semiotician, you think this is perfect.
Right, yeah. No, it's just freighted, isn't it? The entire film, everything about it is symbolic. Every single thing. That's the level it operates on, and it's like so much that we've discussed along the way. I was actually re-listening to our discussion of The Witch recently, and that film does exactly the same thing. It's beautiful, absolutely.
Thought leaves its traces. Yeah, I think that's what happens. I think when you get a project like this, and there's a really great idea or a really great complex of ideas in it, and you get people involved who are talented and thoughtful people, and they get invested in it, the thought that they put into it, the understanding of the project that they put into it, into their performances or their composing or whatever, it just shows. Yeah. And this is one of those texts. This is one of those texts that's just everything feels like it means something, and it's because everybody involved was just so invested in the material, in the text.
And it's amazing how art imitates reality, or reality imitates art, because here we are in a genre that has traditionally been slagged as being trash, and particularly anything at this period. And then you've got Philip Glass working on it, you've got Bernard Rose working on it, you've got all these people who are bringing who in their fields would be considered maybe too good for it, because that's the kind of terrible attitudes. And then there's this film that's about terrible attitudes, and it's got all these people bringing to bear their workmanship on it.
The people who think they're too good for it aren't good enough.
Exactly. And these people who are damn good are going, I'll do that.
I'll do that. Of course I will. Why didn't you ask before?
This film occurred in 1992. For some reason, it feels like a later film to me. It feels like a film that's occurred after the bigger horror renaissances of the 1990s. So after you've had Scream and after you've had the Blair Witch Project, or maybe contemporaneously, because it does not feel like a film from that era.
Now that's interesting.
You're right. It feels like a mature 90s film, doesn't it? Yeah,
it really does.
Absolutely.
I was a bit shocked, to be honest, and I always am. When it's still lingering in the long 80s, technically.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it has that similar kind of disconnect that you find in the first two Hellraiser films, in that Chicago dominates, and yet it feels very like a British film. And I know that's because of the Bernard Rose thing, and you've got that little hangover from Paper House, and you've got the hangover from the text, the original text, and yet, but there's something in the very the very atmosphere of it that feels. I think what it probably was, although there are jump scares, although there is gore, it has a certain what's the word I'm looking for? It doesn't. It holds back at times. It holds back on things it could do in a way that is, for me, reminiscent of a lot of films around that late 80s, early 90s period, but that are set here in the UK. Things like Paper House, or it's just got it's very difficult to articulate, really, but it's got a restraint to it, even though it's got these big images, but it doesn't go and do the full Hollywood thing. There's no flashback. There's no flashback, which I was totally expecting. I think it would have tipped it into
if you don't go and watch the sequel, but there are flashbacks in the sequel, obviously. The sequel's really
ambiguities
interesting.
Are allowed to stand in a way that is more. You find either more in American art house films or European movies. I mean, this film is one big question mark in many respects.
Yeah. It doesn't pin much down, and that's massively to its benefit. I mean, you get, of course, a background for the Candyman. You get the mythology, but that's exactly what it is, right? It's Chinese whispers. You get the story. You get the rumor. There is absolutely no evidence provided that the man who inspired the Candyman myth ever even existed.
No, and I think that's absolutely right, because I think the way to make sense of it is if you turn this into a ghost story, which I understand that the sequels do by making they make the story that is told, the origin story of the Candyman that is told, they make that into an actual a literal fact. It's a thing so that just makes the Candyman into a ghost. It just makes him basically
and
exactly
it really actually it throws some real shade on the nature of the Candyman, because if that were the case, then it would have made more sense for that spirit, that avenging spirit, to be preying on white communities, would it not?
Well, this is one of the things that I find, and I think we'll dig into it in a great deal, but you've just hit upon one of the real big elements of this movie for me, is that it is, the behavior and the function of the Candyman is so fascinating.
What is the Candyman in this film? It is not the ghost or the revenging spirit of the man who the sequels will make, Nathaniel Robitaille.
White society is really not an interest to him until Helen turns up.
It is not that. No. It is not that. He's a living story. That's what he is. He's a manifestation of the myths and the urban legends that have accrued from a historically oppressed culture.
He is the expression of the story that is told. He could have says that himself.
Absolutely.
And the reason that he's preying on other black people, if we want to put it that way, is that the story is told by people in that community about their community. That's all it is. The white people only. The story is very difficult for white people to get their heads around. It's not about us. It's not about us. Fundamentally, not about us. White people only figure in the story as a plot device, basically, as racism comes along and does what it does. The age-old oppression, the age-old oppressors turn up, as they always do when they do that thing they do. And beyond that, we're in the story, we're really nothing more than that. We're really nothing more than a plot device, The story is about that community.
It's about Cabrini Green, right? It's about the characters who are in the film kind of sidelined. You follow Helen Lyle through her eyes, but it is fundamentally about them and about that place, that community, that culture.
Yeah, it's an inter-community story, not an intra-community. It's inter-community. Exactly. It's self-contained. Just like that system that they live in, the Cabrini Green system is kind of a completely self-contained system, at least when they're inside it.
Yeah.
And it really pulled the rug from under my feet, because as I was watching it, you're pushing your awareness forward, as we do when we watch anything. You're trying to second guess the plot, even if you're not doing it actively. And I thought, and it was a real moment. Well, hang on, Candyman's motivations are not vengeance on white society for what's happened to Daniel. It's about, this film is very clearly about becoming one with this woman, Helen, who has diminished the power of his myth, so they can build it up again and scare the living shit out of everyone. And he calls the society of Cabrini Green, of the projects, his congregation.
Exactly.
So, viewed at one way, this is a vengeful God that takes sacrifices, black sacrifices mainly. So you have this backstory that is presented to you, but the victims do not represent the society that once ruined him. That is not the point here, as Jack, as you just illustrated. And I thought, whoa, this film is just kicked into a very, very interesting and sophisticated place by not being that which I kind of thought it was going to be.
Yeah. It takes it to a new level. The Candyman is black because the people in the stories we write tend to be like us. We tell stories about the devil, and the devil's always a white guy in a black suit or a red suit or whatever. That's all it is. That's the only reason he's black in the story. It's because it's their story.
It's their story. That's exactly it. It belongs to them. It's their culture. It's their history. That's what he is. He's a manifestation of all of the evils and oppressions and abuses that have been heaped upon black culture since time out of mind.
And this is why I find the final scene so fascinating and polysemic, because I don't think the congregation go to Helen out of the sympathetic, well, gee, thanks for saving baby Anthony, although I think that's probably in there partly. I think what goes on is they dump the hook on her copy side. Back, right? Thanks, Whitey. You've appropriated something fucking else.
Exactly. Take it back. We don't want. We're done with this now.
And it almost read to me like an act of defiance. And of course, I thought it was quite amusing that Helen plunges her hook into white patriarchy first.
But that's another one of the layers and levels of disparity, isn't it, that this film talks about, which is, of course, the sexual politics. It's that is so brilliant to me. The fact that, and of course, the sequels never follow that. Sadly, Helen never goes on to become like the next.
Now, I might be off-piste on this, but and I'd be interested to hear what you guys think about that. But that final scene very much felt like anger we had a story, regardless of the effects it generally had, and we took control of that story as well. They take control of it with the bonfire. They kill Candyman. But there's also this sense in the funeral sequence of you took this. You want the damn story, you can have the damn story.
You take it, become it.
There's anger there.
I think so. Yeah, that's certainly my reading of it. It is not. I mean, if it becomes, thank you for saving us, then it becomes a white savior narrative, right? Yeah. And I think the film is cleverer than that. I mean, it's there, and you can read it in that way if you want, but I think it's an incorrect reading.
I mean, look at Vanessa Estelle's fucking acting in that scene. She is not playing that intention. No. She is not playing that intention in that scene. So I was very surprised when I read synopses. And I thought, well, how interesting. I wonder who wrote these synopses. Where they're like, and the congregation turns up to sort of pay homage to Helen for saving baby Anthony. I thought, that's not what's going on in that scene.
No, you have to bear in mind, she brought him back, right?
Yeah.
She's the one who as the Candyman himself says, he's obliged to come back because she's sowing doubt.
But I love the fact that he didn't need to come back as long as someone had adopted his mantle in the real material world, which is what the guy who was arrested. Yeah. That's brilliant. That's such a deft piece of understanding about mythology and anthropologically speaking, the role of the trickster and so on. They take on the mantle of the ghosts, the specters, and everything. Well, if you take that person away, if you remove them from their environment and incarcerate them, the story's got to come back.
I mean, it's fascinating
needs to find a new trickster.
Looking at the Candyman himself, how much agency he actually has, because it seems to me he doesn't have a great deal. He's a functionary of a wider metaphysical engine, which is born from historical abuse. He doesn't seem to have a great deal of agency in and of himself. He's just doing what the stories and the histories oblige him to, in the same way that he's operating in the ways that the stories oblige him to be. So there are certain images in this film that are drawn directly from racist narrative against black men.
Very much so.
Certain images that are really quite, you watch them as a sort of, it's a liberal lefty white person. You're like, I'm not sure I like this. And it's doing it very deliberately. it's arguable that sometimes it tips over the edge and it goes too far with them. And of course, by evoking them anyway, it kind of reinforces them. So that's a wrinkle, that's a problem. But it's like images like, for example, when Helen is laid out in the depths of Cabrini Green, and there's the hook sort of, there's like an almost intimation of sexual violence going on. That obviously recalls certain racist narratives about the big scary black man attacking and raping white women. And the reason for that is within the mythology of the Candyman himself. It's this notion of him being comprised of stories, and that is sadly one of them.
Well, it's also invoking cinema history as well, because it's subverting the image of just that from Griffith's Birth of a Nation.
Oh God, yeah.
You know, so it's rewiring the meanings in those images, because in a sense, all film, it's just waves in space. It's just
and don't
images.
get me wrong, it's polysemic, and therefore it is problematic by evoking it.
Course,
I mean, that's the problem, isn't it, with any of these texts?
When you start playing around with tropes or stereotypes or cliches, you're still playing around with them, even if you're making a new point with them. So of course, it's a troublesome area.
It really is. It really is. And I've read stuff from black scholars who watch this film who say that it is problematic. It is problematic in many ways, but it within the context of the film, it is also kind of necessary.
I mean, I think there's a very good. Oh, sorry, Jack. Please go on.
No, please go ahead.
I was just going to say very quickly, so I can hit the ball to you. Is there is a great deal of this film which does seem to be making Candyman into a symbol of, if you like, of white anxiety about the socially mobile black man. I mean, you look at him, his dress, his manner, the way his elegance, his sheer charisma. Yeah. He was a talented artist. His use of language. He is the personification of black men as being perceived that is more than just slaves and grunts for white privilege. And that thing that disturbs white society, the black person who might be better at being civilized and cultured than them. And of course, then you get all the anxieties around sexual potency, physical athleticism, that inform all the racism that emerges from these barely repressed fears, right down to, the very reductive racism of the massive hook, the huge member. I mean, this is a guy who's lost his artist's hand. He's gained a massive hook that castrates. It's uncomfortable stuff because, as you say, it's playing with the very images and the very connotations and the very libels that Candyman also seems to be violently rejecting as this kind of vengeful god. But which is indifferent on certain points. And it's almost that thing where you're like, this is where it gets into territory, because this is a story about black people's story in a film made by white people, largely. So you're inevitably going to run into these troubles. But I think one can still make a really big argument, like the distance between here and Birth of a Nation is great. Sorry, Jack, I railroaded you there, please.
No, that's wonderful. I think that does tie in exactly to what I was thinking, which was that stories do not exist in isolation. They don't grow in isolation. And we were just talking about how Candyman is their story, the people of Cabrini Green. That's not to say, of course, that the story just appears there ex nihilo. It comes from a world of stories. It comes from the stories that the entire society tells. We know from the work of Frantz Fanon that the oppressed, the colonized, they absorb some of the racist image of them that is held by the colonizer, by the oppressor. I think that's true in every society of oppressed and colonized people. And I think it's true that black storytelling has some areas of continuity with white storytelling about black people, even including racist storytelling about black people.
Yes, sadly, inevitably, right?
Yeah. And the thing that this zones in on is a sort of an area of continuity where, of course, the white woman and the black man, that is a locus of anxiety. It's one of the pillars of white supremacist ideology. And yet, of course, the story isn't about it's not about a rape, it's about a love affair.
Yes.
So you can look at it another way, which is you can see it as a story about equality. You can see it about transgressing these hierarchies and these racial lines, these sort of lines of apartheid and stuff like that. So it's interesting to me that Candyman does seem absolutely set upon acquiring Helen in some way. And it does contain all that uncomfortable imagery. You know, there's where she first sees him, she's in a parking lot alone. You know, sort of the archetypal sort of woman alone in the crime-ridden city. Here's a scary black dude. You know, from a million episodes of Law and Order. It is there. It absolutely is there. But the thing is, it's like Candyman is kind of written that way. He doesn't have agency. He does just play his story, play his role over and over and over again. And you know, it's like it has a connotation outside that community and a different connotation inside that community. He just means different things. He just inevitably, you take him out of that community and you put him into Helen's world, he just inevitably looks like something else. And what we're doing when we look at him, when we see him through that prism, we are just being that other society that just inevitably looks at him as something else. And it makes you realize that is, even if you're conscious of it and even if you're consciously opposed to it, it makes you realize that so much of your perceptual apparatus as a white person in our society is just built of these white supremacist assumptions.
Even if you're conscious of them
and you don't like them and you know they're bullshit, they're still part of how your brain is constructed because you're raised in this world.
This is so, you're so on the button with this, because while I was watching it, I thought, well, hang on here. It's so significant how Daniel's relationship has been portrayed, you know, son of a slave who becomes an artist, not preying on a white woman, even though it's slightly framed as though this could be the way in to the story, because it's a racist trope. It's surrounding things like miscegenation, but it's established this is reciprocated love. And when he's lynched, they take away his hand, the mechanism by which not only he made that art, which gave him that way into white society, but it's because of his artistic impulses, his sensitivities that, you know, reach his lover's heart. You know, so you're absolutely right. We've got this apparatus about, we are aware of white middle class fear of mixed couples with biracial children, for example, long and extensive history of that bollocks. First interracial kisses on film and television, the huge hostile reactions, and this film is like leading you there, and then saying it's your apparatus, either because, you know, in case of some people, these are the prejudices and the bigotries you hold, or it's because you're hyper aware of them. Now, whether that justifies it, and I can completely understand why perhaps people would go, hang on a moment, I can kind of see this, but it's still a very, very dodgy area, and you don't quite achieve it always in the film. It's still quite a coup to pull. Because, you know, as a, you know, one of the world's many wet liberals, I sat there going, oh gosh, but hang on, this is dealing with me. This is dealing with, you know, these vile ideas like, well, as I said, miscegenation and things like that. And it's doing something else, and it's saying, you were wrong about that. But the apparatus, absolutely.
And it's doing that wonderful thing of throwing it in your face, which is such a brave thing to do. It's deliberately making you uncomfortable. It's making you sit there and watch this. And it's not the horrific elements. It's not the gore. It's not the violence per se. It's the recollection of these. Even if you haven't seen the images, if you haven't watched Birth of a Nation or anything like that, you have them in your mind.
Of course.
You know what they are.
I mean, we've got them in our mind from, I mean, all sorts of. I mean, you don't have to be so interested in film that you sit through Griffith. I mean, they're even in things like crassly and things like King Kong, for Christ's sake, which is shown on every Easter on BBC
Cartoons,
Two.
Right?
Cartoons. It's everywhere. It just permeates because the idea. Beware the black male.
Yeah, this is what it's about, right? This is what the Candyman himself is, right? He is the manifestation of the evils of history, if you really want to boil it down.
Yeah.
He is the darkness that comes from historical oppression.
I mean, for Christ's sake, the sight of the lynching gives rise to the projects. That's Overlook Hotel territory right there.
So, and again, like over a course of centuries, the abuse is still the same effectively, right? It's just happening to entire communities now.
But there is an interesting way in which this is slightly different, because it is absolutely the horror of history, the social wound of history, etc., repeating, still there, still haunting. But there's an interesting way in which it's mediated in this film, because he's not just that, is he? He's mediated by the fact that he is the story that people tell to express that.
Right.
In exactly the same way that the site of the lynching, it's not simply that the horror and the injustice just sit there and continue, and then they give birth to Cabrini Green. Places like Cabrini Green, and it's very difficult from the after the failure to really grasp this, but places like Cabrini Green came from an almost utopian equalizing impulse. This is very true of the housing estates, in Britain. Exactly the sort of place where Barker sets his original story.
Of course, the Spectre Street estate.
Yeah, these places, they became the dreadful term sinkholes. But we know what's being we know what's being referred to there. But they started out in very much the same way, and it's linked by the same architectural style, and it's linked by so many of the same utopian impulses within modernism. They started out in the same way as the skyscrapers, the corporate skyscrapers of Chicago, and also the housing projects of Chicago. Both have their genus, their roots in that utopian modernism, which saw we rationalize the human social world. We make it clean and neat and tidy and made of utilitarian boxes. We clear off we carve out the rubbish from the center of the city, as Le Corbusier put it. And then we can remake ourselves anew. If we put these, and it's a way of doing it without reckoning with their actual humanity or their or the actual injustice or the actual need to empower people and make real equality. Of course, you think that what you do is you put them into a nicer cage, and they'll start behaving themselves.
A supremely alienating environment.
And ahistorical, right? It's an ahistorical utopian project. You can't erase history. No. It's not going to happen.
That's why one of the most fascinating images that we've got is Brazilia, and just seeing the absolute failure on a massive scale. How do you alienate an entire population, and everything about that place, where the roads were so wide that people couldn't walk down them, and now the grass and trees and weeds just push through buildings, and the remnants of it, the shell, it's extraordinary. But then of course it's an extraordinary moment in architecture, because, just speaking personally, it's simultaneously fascinating and oddly attractive to look at, as it is repellent and politically, fascistic in so many respects.
There always was that sort of inherently fascistic core to the utopian dreams of modernism. It always kind of relied upon this idea of the perfectible human. If you create the perfect box for a human being, then the human being kind of has to look a certain way in order to fit in there.
Yes, and it's a very short mutilate themselves, sculpt themselves into the desirable shape, right?
Or they won't, in which case they have to be excised in some other way, presumably by the social planner or the architect or whatever, who knows the shape they should be. And if they won't fit into the box, which is perfect, remember, it's the perfect machine for living in, they don't fit into it, then where do we put them? We put them somewhere else, don't we?
Well, we put them in jail, don't we? Let's be honest. We put them in jail. That's what we do. We criminalize and put them in jail.
This is where I found... for a number of reasons, and I will probably bore the pants off you, but I keep coming back to it. This is why I did find Bernardet such an interesting character, because I thought, well, particularly at the beginning of the film where we first enter Cabrini Green, and I thought, Bernardet here is someone who's very conscious of her, if you like, her class precariousness as a mixed race, but politically black, because let's face it, once you're mixed race, you're politically black, always, because it's white society. Entering this poor black neighborhood And I just thinking to myself, she knows she's part of if you like, a sliver of black people who have enjoyed social mobility. Their talents still policed by dominant white patriarchy. Helen sees herself as further away from the social economic strata of Cabrini Green. Of course she does. So therefore her behavior is bolder.
Yeah.
She manages to use, that. I love how when I say I love, it's like, it's sort of abominable, but at the same time, it's a very interesting character point when Helen sort of uses how her condo is a former project building as a kind of way to parallel herself. I know where I am. I know what I'm doing. It's an extraordinary moment. But I think Bernardet, being conscious of the flaws in that thinking, here are women that are potential victims of the young man in the vicinity of which Helen's whiteness does not make her immune, but she carries the arrogance of the colonialist entering the heart of darkness.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I love Bernadette's positioning in this, because she
kind
knows...
of shelters behind Helen when they're in the estate, doesn't she? She kind of Helen's all-conquering arrogance, the all-conquering arrogance of the white woman. I don't belong here. I belong wherever I want to put myself.
Wherever I want to go, yeah.
Bernadette shelters under that. And it's very telling, I think, that one of the ways in which Helen protects herself is to allow the guys on the estate to mistake her for a cop as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Bernadette is very deferential to Helen, isn't she? In a way that's it's very uncomfortable to watch.
Helen goes into rooms first, and it's not just her courage. Her misplaced courage, her naivete, her arrogance.
No, their dynamic.
It's other things going on.
Their dynamic does sort of recall sort of master-servant, doesn't it? And that is really problematic,
But it's that wider thing into the dichotomy that surrounds, black people in a white-dominated society anyway. And all I kept thinking about with regards to Bernadette was this idea of, you can be invited to the party, but what anxieties are stoked in the party? And one of the anxieties that Bernadette represents, and actually is a parallel with Candyman himself, is this idea of exceptionalism. Bernadette's exceptional. Daniel was exceptional. So looked at from a certain reactionary point of view. I'm here. So that can lead to a kind of, if you like, quote unquote, civilized persecution.
Yeah.
And what's the alternative to a kind of civilized persecution of knowing your place? Well, you end up in the ghetto. And you eke out a life of subsistence where you can be dehumanized and feared and ignored like the people of Cabrini Green. So I kept watching them going, well, which serves white society best? Both. So you can appear tolerant on the basis of, and I love this because it's the illusions that white capitalist liberal society tells itself, of merit, never permitting the notion that meritocracy is a total illusion, a total fabrication. So we have this really interesting...
And a pernicious lie as well.
It's a complete pernicious lie. And an overt one as well, an obvious one.
Yes.
It's one we just accept.
It's like
the
child's logic could see through it.
Yeah, but the greatest con ever perpetuated on humanity, right?
But it's just... So it's fascinating to see this from sort of several angles lately, I thought, because it just so happened this film dropped when literally the same night. I'm as we know, I've joked about it before, I'm a Johnny come lately to many things, and I'm 20 years, I'm nearly 30 or 35 years late for this, but I'm 20 years late to The Wire. And
right. Oh wow.
The Wire absolutely riffs on Candyman. With one of its particular characters, the character of Omar, who creates his own mythology, and the other gangs absolutely are terrified of him, and he seems to be able to just turn up in different places, almost spectrally. But the other thing I've been rewatching, in addition to The Wire, and I watched The Wire about 2 hours before I sat down with Candyman, so my brain exploded. But the other thing I've been watching of a morning with my morning coffee during the week is a series I loved as a teenager, and it's the animated show Daria.
Oh my!
So all I kept thinking about it was the character. I don't know how good your brains are, how much you remember, or if you've ever saw the show, but there's a character in it who is almost analog to Bernadette, and her name is Jodie, and she's this in the story, I mean, she's a teenage girl, but she's this seriously pushed young black woman from an aspiring middle-class black family, basically locked into having to be exceptional in a white-dominated school and a white-dominated neighborhood. And her parents have absorbed a great deal of elite white codes. Now, she's got a boyfriend in the series called Mac. He's from a lower social economic strata, if you like. Less pressure on him, although that's partly connected to his maleness and his position on the football team. So his academic success, you know, can be circumvented by a sports scholarship. But Mac is permitted within the way the cartoon, the animated show runs, to exhibit more of the signifiers, if you like, of modern urban black youth culture. His clothes, his music. Jodie, no, like Bernardet, she's dressed very conservative, like a good middle-class white girl. So you get this, as in Candyman, it throws up these enormous contradictions about multicultural societies. And the tragedy, which Candyman gets so close to, being this whole, well, you're damned if you do, if you're damned if you don't, nature of society where whites traditionally hold the most levers of power. They get to reproduce their culture far more, or appropriate black culture, which the film really follows down to, as I say, in the end with over Helen's grave. And I thought, wow, all these things are interlinking at the same time in my viewing, and it's like my brain's gonna pop.
But it's amazing. I mean, you are absolutely right. There are like strata of disparity throughout the film, aren't there?
But The Wire definitely is conscious in the depiction, in the portrayal of Omar. It is conscious of Candyman. I swear it. It's pulling on it.
Absolute brilliance. I mean, even with Helen, right? Even though she is generally presented as almost like having a colonialist mindset with regards to Cabrini Green, you know, it's her project. That's all she really cares about. That's what they are to her. It's her project, and it's a way. It's, in fact, you can even read it in a very sinister way, in that it's a way for her to escape her own oppression to a certain degree. If she can get this project off the ground,
she's a victim of patriarchy.
There as well, isn't there? You know, the word project. Firstly, that it's a housing project.
It's called the project, right? Absolutely.
It's Helen's project. It seems these people are always some white person's project, aren't they?
Yes, they're never people.
Even the mural suddenly has her on it at the end. She imprints herself on the mural.
Yes.
And of course, she then imprints herself on Daniel's story, because there's this intimation that she looks exactly like, which I'm sure comes from her, this idea that she looks like the lover. And, you know, here we go, history rhyming again. But
well, it depends on how you interpret it, doesn't it? I mean, you could it depends on how literally you take that image. That could just be the story incorporating her. She has to be on the mural because she's now part of the story.
I think, you see, I actually differ with both of you quite strongly on this, because I think what's happening at the end is the exact opposite of a white person appropriating a black story or black culture. I think black, you know, to put it in those terms, black culture has actually taken her. The people of Cabrini Green, they've actually taken control of their stories. But Candyman is, in my opinion, definitively destroyed. Not only as an entity, to the extent that he is actually an entity, but as a story. And he's destroyed by the people of Cabrini Green. It's actually a kind of a rebellion against tyranny. They actually say
very explicit.
He's in the bonfire. We've got him cornered. You know, we've got him caught. The kid gives the alarm. The community turn out and they burn it. They burn Candyman. Candyman is destroyed. And his sort of great final trick there is thwarted by Helen. She saves the baby from the bonfire. And yes, it has all these tropes and all these connotations built into it. So obviously it's always going to be tricky and problematic. The white savior narrative, etc. It is in there, just like the predatory black man trope is in there. So is the white savior narrative in there. But I think what the film is, what's happening there is that trope itself is being reappropriated, because I see the mural at the end very much as something that the community did out of admiration and out of fascination and love, not necessarily for her, but for the story that she has become, for the story that they've turned her into. I think that's what's happening at the funeral. When they turn up, they throw the hook to Helen, and they're saying, firstly, you know, this is this is not going to be needed anymore because the creature that wielded it has gone. And it's also a handover. It's, it's like, this is your trophy. You won. This is your reward. You got it. And you are now the story. You are now the story that we tell. And it's interesting that the story now appears to be that the revenge is being played out against white people.
Yes.
Because the killing that we see at the end is the killing of
Trevor.
Trevor, yeah, exactly. Who is the archetype within Helen's world. He is the archetype of the oppressor.
Yeah.
We're talking about how Helen has this arrogant, paternalistic attitude towards Bernardet. Well, when Helen is with Trevor, or even more so Purcell, it's completely the opposite. She then becomes everything that Bernardet is in her relationship with Helen. She becomes beaten down and humiliated and fighting for status and fighting to be taken seriously, etc., with them sort of overriding her and telling her to be quiet. Yeah. And the film, the story has actually, the people of Cabrini Green have rewritten their story. They have taken Helen as kind of raw material, and they've created a new story about this angelic woman with fire for hair, and she has taken the place of Candyman. She's the story that they tell now.
That's interesting. Then it becomes more like a palimpsest, doesn't it? Because he's burnt away. She's there.
She doesn't kill them anymore. That woman doesn't kill them.
No.
That woman protects them. And of course, it has got all that stuff built into it. And as I say, we are still dealing with a kind of a white savior narrative, but we're also looking at an example of a white person being used as sort of material for an act of black storytelling.
Yeah.
Which is
and
a kind
story
of triumph.
that's a weapon as well. That's beautiful. That's kind of beautiful. I love that. I
definitely saw the thing of like passing on the baton. I must admit, I did read it much more negatively in the sense of, you've appropriated another thing. Here you go, then. Go knock yourself out.
Not how it looks
but
to me.
I really do like this interpretation because I think, and I don't think it's free floating either. Because actually, as I was listening to you deliver it, I was like, actually, so much of this story is about that community trying to seize a runaway story, and they do seize it, a story that's run out of control and is taking them, and they have dealt with it through the act of the bonfire, and now, I like
that a lot, actually. Yeah, I think that's a brilliant interpretation.
When she turns up at the head of the procession at the funeral, she's not glaring at Helen, she's glaring at Trevor. She's glaring at Trevor's girlfriend. She's glaring at the white people around the grave. This paltry collection of white people.
Don't you love how they react to it as well? Don't you love how they react to the black congregation?
Terrified.
They are
so
terrified.
Yeah.
And it's quite interesting because even Trevor, who it's so arresting how easily Helen's life can change and does change through misunderstanding, or if it is indeed misunderstanding, there's a lot of layers here, and yet there's this man who is fundamentally afraid of her when she returns to the condo, and yet everything is on his side. He can get her incarcerated for months and sedated for months, and so when it starts to skew into that level where you are seeing a woman who is made victim, someone who's manipulated, railroaded by male colleagues and superiors, I love the way she is coddled by the same cop who then sends her to an institution. It's a fascinating turnaround, and then of course at the mercy of Candyman, who while this supposed victim of race-motivated torture and murder can use power against her still.
Yeah,
it's like, whoa, the layering.
It's fascinating, isn't it? The only time when in the world that Trevor dominates, the domestic and the academic, the sort of polite white society, the only time Helen has agency in that world is when she's lost it, when she's been ejected from it for being defective, for being deficient, right?
When he's physically afraid of her.
When he's physically afraid of her, when she's like a virus to it, she can't be there because she's tainted now.
Yeah.
And I want to give some props to the actress who plays Trevor's young girlfriend.
Oh, Stacey.
Particularly in the scene where Helen turns back up at the apartment, having escaped the mental hospital, and she just walks into the apartment, and the girl is painting the wall, and she's not conscious of her there, and she just walks through the apartment. She walks up behind her, and then she just speaks. The way the actress portrays the reaction when she, when the character realizes that who's there and that it's Helen. The way she does that it's one of the most authentic fear reactions I've ever seen put on screen.
It's really good.
It's very
like
good
supreme. Initially, she starts almost as if it's supreme social awkwardness, and then it bleeds into fear, and then it bleeds into a kind of laughter which she can't. It's extraordinary, the gambits that
and it's so quick as well.
Through. Yeah,
and she does it. She does it with this sort of collapsing body language.
Yeah,
she turns sees and instantly starts falling apart.
Yeah,
it's so good
with this pathetic pink paint everywhere. It's just gorgeous. Oh wow.
In fact, everyone's reaction to Helen at that point is fantastic, and I love the way that Helen is playing it. She's so still and poised at that moment, which she hasn't been for the longest time. She's been sublimely out of control. Now these forces are in her life, and suddenly she gains agency here.
Still, I think it's a really good word. I think Virginia Madsen's got a wonderful quality of stillness about her, which she uses. Which expresses she uses to express so much psychological and emotional depth.
She's one of David Lynch's alumni, isn't she? She's in a few of Lynch's films. She's in Dune, I do believe.
Yeah,
she is. She's Princess Irulan. Which, in terms of her actual screen time, she hasn't got very much, but she is kind of officially the narrator of the film. She turns up at the very start as the storyteller, if you like, and in the various extended cuts that there are, she turns up as that narrator more often.
To play Helen, you needed someone of a very particular quality, of course, aesthetically alone, to contrast against Tony Todd, and also to stand up to the force of that performance.
Yeah.
I mean, can we talk about Tony Todd? I mean, bloody hell!
Oh wow,
Jesus Christ! What? This is one of the great horror performances, isn't it? This is a monster unlike any other.
You compare this to Freddy Krueger with his sniggering and cackling and so on. It's almost embarrassing.
It is almost embarrassing.
This is so much in a different league.
Well, oddly,
to any of that other crap.
You've just mentioned something there which occurred to me. I mean, Nightmare on Elm Street. This film seems to be trolling Elm Street because it seems to be offering something that exploits. Actually, I think Elm Street has an inspired premise, and some of its plot structure. The fact that the leading lady is put in a psychiatric hospital, but it offers this content that is so raw, so politically potent, and so much better delivered. It immediately kicks it aside, and Tony Todd is instrumental in that. But also, Tony Todd manages this incredible feat because Candyman is a story. He has to work through certain predetermined sequences. And yet, even though what I'm about to refer to now is another great horror performance and another great horror character, somehow Candyman makes Barker's other great film character, Pinhead, look kind of impotent. He's so much more active in a scenario. Pinhead says a lot. In the first two movies, but didn't necessarily do much.
Both those Barker created figures are both very, in their different ways, they're very rule bound, aren't they?
Yeah, both of them.
But Candyman seems to have a great deal more physical agency than Pinhead.
And of course, I love as we often do dip into, and I hasten to say, not in a glib way, but we do often try and pull out the sort of meta influences. I mean, that was almost ostensibly how this began. Those films which were sort of aware of themselves as story or aware of themselves as films. I think the moment when Jake is told Candyman isn't real, it's just a bad man wearing a costume, is just beautifully loaded, because in a sense that's true. Someone else, another actor, has been playing Candyman until Tony Todd comes along and then has to restore the story. But then it's there everywhere. It's murals, semiotic student, gang leader who appropriates the legend just mentioned, the cosplaying, stills pictures, graffiti, mirrors that are lead into bigger spaces. We're into looking glass, but they literally do.
I mean, you're misunderstanding the way stories work in a child's mind anyway. It doesn't matter if an adult tells you it's not real. You know full well that it is.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, it's funny, isn't it, that we spend half our time telling children that characters who are actually just made up and people wearing costumes are real, and then the other half the time we spend telling them no, it's not real, it's just a person in a costume.
I mean, if you strip away all the everything in the film, it really almost does come down to, this is what happens if you explain away stories. This is what happens if you debunk myths. If you show the man in the costume, the story might lose potency for an imaginative audience. So the story comes through itself as a personification to correct it. And it's like the best revenge trope imaginable. The story is going, no, I am the writing on the wall. I am the whisper in the classroom. Without these things, I am nothing. That's, hell yeah.
But it's also about the ability of people to, if you go with my reading of the last act of the film, it's also about the ability of people to take control of their stories,
of their narratives.
Yes, it is about that agency.
To end stories that have reached the end of their useful life and to make new ones.
And it's interesting that it is a film that
new realities or potential realities.
In the case of the Candyman, it's to exercise those stories which are in and of themselves expressions and perpetuants of the historical violence they've always suffered. Right?
It kind of is an example of what Fanon talks about when he talks about people in oppressed populations or colonized populations absorbing some of the view of them that the colonizer has, because they've created this story to express their condition. But at the same time, the story has become a kind of a predator upon them. Yeah. The story is their story, but it's also aggressive to them. It's denigrating to them. It's predatory upon them.
And it's reinforcing all of the negative connotations that have been attached to them throughout history.
Yes.
It's abusive by its very nature.
Of a story where the people in it seize control of it is particularly interesting, I thought, because the film constantly is riffing on one particular story which is about people locked into a narrative they cannot escape because it's to do with prophecy, and it's the amount of riffs on Macbeth in this film. I mean, not only in terms of things like bathrooms, out damn spot. I love how bathrooms are both a place to relieve guilt and where waste and unwanted things are flushed away. I think that's absolutely brilliant. But the fact that when she wakes up, and what is that, a baby from her belly untimely ripped when she wakes up in Anne-Marie's house and she's been hooked in the belly. There's several times riffing on that play. The everlasting bonfire. I mean, there it is, the porter's speech. But in Macbeth, of course, they're locked into that. They can't seize control. And here, to pun on Fanon, the wretched of the earth seize control of their own story. It's rather like in that respect, the weird sisters are the only ones able to seize control.
I think round about the time this film was made, there was a British television production of Macbeth that was made on a British housing estate. It was called Macbeth on the Estate, I think.
I remember that, yes.
Yeah,
I remember
that. I think it was Owen Griffith as Macbeth. I can't remember the rest of the cast, but loads of the cast members were just people from the estate. Like the lead actors were professional actors, but loads of the other parts were played by people on the estate. And I remember watching that at the time. And it's interesting in that regard how well these things fit together, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very
There's
strange,
definite continuity, like the same thing with Chicago, apparently conjuring up these similar sort of aesthetics of horror to do with the architecture of utopianism perverted into a kind of trappedness, a kind of gigantic mousetrap that people get caught in,
and
because it's not
that was
fundamentally designed for people.
A real thing as well. The story that partly inspired Barker was about someone who had climbed in through someone's medicine cabinet behind their bathroom mirror, because and that takes the dystopia at the heart of the utopian modernist project to a very literal nightmare. It's like you can actually have people crawl into your fucking house through the medicine cabinet, and then to tack that into a movie where the mirror ritual, the thing that frightened me off the film for decades, being almost in a way this desire, do you dare to look into history, the whole horrible cruelness of it, and do you dare to see that you're a part of it, you see your own reflection in it. I mean, wow, that's a huge concept.
This is one of the huge problems with the sequel, actually. It, of course, being a far less clever film, it tries to explain why the mirrors, when of course you don't need to. The mirrors are part of superstition. They're part, they're things that have been part of human superstition for generations. There are entire cultures that are still terrified of mirrors.
Well,
and I should say as well
of summoning an evil spirit by looking in the mirror and saying its name 3 times or 5 times.
It's been part of witchcraft for the longest time,
ancient.
Right? Yeah, it's ancient. It's absolutely ancient, and it has become part of like urban legend now. It's Bloody Mary, of course.
Bloody Mary, exactly, and Charlie, and God knows how many other urban legends. And that's, again, you don't need to explain why Candyman looks the way he does. Nope. He looks the way he does because he looks like a child's drawing. When you look at some of the long shots of Candyman, that's what struck me on this rewatch. I was thinking, he looks like a kid's drawing of a big scary man. With the big coat that's easy to draw, and the feet sticking out the bottom, and one hand is a hook, etc. He just looks like a kid's drawing.
Cross-hatched trousers and everything. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's derived from the short story, of course, not the actual image, but the notion of him being slightly absurd. The original Candyman is bizarre and in
the short story he's kind of brightly coloured, isn't he?
Yeah, he's got like rouge cheeks, and he's got blue lips. And he has like yellow hair, I believe. Yeah, he's an odd. He looks like a child has gone nuts with a set of Crayola.
yeah.
Funny that image as well. Just going back a conversation of the bloody hole in her stomach. That's some very interesting layering, because of course part of the reason Daniel was lynched was for impregnating his white lover. Then she wakes up with a hole in her stomach, but a baby has been snatched, but it's Anne-Marie's baby. It's like, whoa, that scrambling of signifiers, and it's been done to semiotic student. I mean, that's because the semiotics of that moment don't add up. That's brilliant. She won't be able to work it up, and partly she won't be able to work it out because he's basically creating this whole scenario around her. And what I love about that is you can, if you so choose. Now, this would actually annoy me in another horror film, but for some reason this film gets away with it. You could put a lot of this down to this all emerged, this whole thing emerged out of her head trauma when she was smacked with a hook by the cosplaying Candyman. You can literally see the film through that lens if you choose to.
Yeah.
And that would normally bug me.
It reduces it enormously to look at it that way. But it is there. I mean, you get it. What
I'm saying is, you get this way of watching the film through several lenses, and I think it would be interesting to watch it through the reduced lens. I don't think it will impair it, because I don't think there's one. This film is basically saying you will not have one definitive reading of me. It's slippery as hell, but I would actually like to try and watch the film at some point with the discipline of going.
Candyman is not literally there.
Work as he's purely a projection, and that she is just used, but she's got a head full of these stories from pre the head trauma. Because I really think the only thing that could probably break the illusion, the reductive illusion, and in fact, it's probably the one scene that I'm. Bearing in mind, I've only seen this film once, but it was the one scene which left me thinking, have they maybe fired their shot here about the elusiveness of what Candyman is? And it is the death of Bernardet. That's the one point where it seems to cross into being more of, this is an entity. This is a... because it's very hard to know how much, editorially speaking, we can... Because she does seem to... I mean, she's looking away from Helen, and it's how much the film is playing with our perceptions. But even when a film plays with one's perceptions, it's got to follow certain rules. And I found that scene just slightly out of kilter, because it was the one point where I thought, Bernadette can see something, and I don't think she sees Helen.
But if all the people in Helen's life that would be able to see him or partly see him, it would be Bernardet.
It would be Bernardet, wouldn't it? Given her ancestry, yeah.
That's very true.
Yeah,
that's a very good way of reconciling that. Yes, thank you.
Because she is the bridge, isn't she? She is the bridge between those two worlds.
That's a very, very shrewd
that really
point.
fits. Yeah, that really fits.
Yeah. No, that fits better than I thought then. When I watched that in real time, it was the one point where I thought, oh, we've hammered out an ambiguity. But now maybe we haven't. That's interesting. Yeah.
But it's fascinating.
Speaking of the short story. Yeah. Sorry, go on.
No, go on.
Well, speaking of the short story, I read it for the first time in preparation for this because I'm working my way through the Books of Blood. I'm all the way through volumes 1 to 3. So I think Forbidden.
Just as an aside, Jack, if you want to come on to do one of the Books of Blood with Kit and I, please let us know.
I'd love to. Welcome. Yes,
be most welcome.
Yeah. I'd love
you
to.
Too, you too,
thank you. Yeah, because I love a bit of Barker in my life.
Yeah.
Well, I asked you to, for the benefit of the listeners, I asked you, George, to recommend me some of the Books of Blood in volumes 4 to 6, which I haven't read yet, that are in some way sort of in my view of things Halloween appropriate, that are something to do with ghosts or spectres or something like that. And you recommended me 2, one of which I haven't got to yet, the other of which was called In the Flesh, which I loved. I loved that story. I thought that was marvelous, absolutely
beautiful
marvelous
story.
So yeah, I'm really blown away by that. It instantly became one of my favorites from all the Books of Blood that I've read so far. But I also read The Forbidden, which I hadn't read before, in preparation for this, and I was struck as I was reading it. And I was thinking, yeah, this feels very close to the book. And I hadn't rewatched the film by then, but I was thinking this does feel very close to the film. What I'm reading, and then when I eventually did rewatch the film in preparation, which was after I'd read the story, I was struck by just how faithful the film is up to a certain point. Once you get to a certain point in the plot, and the film goes off in its own direction, because obviously it needs to be a 2-hour film instead of a 15-page short story.
Of course.
Up to a certain point in the plot, the film is remarkably true to the short story.
Extremely
the dog
faithful
is even there, and things like this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And despite this relocation to Cabrini Green, it's amazing, isn't it? What the film does. What I find, what the film does is it's exactly what Kubrick did when he took Stephen King's film, novel, The Shining. He takes the elements, the base sort of structure, and swells it, layers other concerns into it. That's what this film does. I do prefer the film version of the story. I'll be honest. I mean, they do different things. They operate on slightly different levels. They're doing different things. The short story is more focused on mythology within class structure and commentary on class disparity. Not exclusively, because if you're talking about class disparity, then you are going to be talking about racial politics implicitly. But the film just layers in so much more stuff.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I've felt about the stories from the Books of Blood that I've read so far is how compact they are, given how much potential each idea has. Every story feels like it's you take an idea with so much potential, and what he's doing with it is he's sort of compacting it down into the shortest space he possibly can.
Yes.
Almost every one I've read feels like a novel that's been crammed down into a much smaller format.
I can't remember who it was. It may have been J.G. Ballard, actually, on one of the editions of Books of Blood. He says there's more ideas in like a single paragraph of these stories than most writers manage in entire novels.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Certainly, most of the ones I've read so far. Yeah,
I mean, one of the big differences, of course, between the Forbidden and the Candyman is that the Forbidden is there's a nihilism in Candyman too, but the nihilism in the Forbidden is really powerful. It's pervasive throughout the entire story. There's such cynicism and darkness in the short story.
Yes, there's nothing. If you want to look at the end of the film, as in some way redemptive, with the implication that the people of Cabrini Green have taken control of their stories and rewritten them in some way to be something better, that's not going to predate upon them. If you want to look at it that way, then there's very marked shift in emphasis, because there's no such redemptive turn at the end of the story at all. It's fact, literally just that the story just consumes Helen completely.
Yeah, it's abjection as well. It's human abjection. I mean, there's some very bitter commentaries on the way, even like the people of it's Spectre Street, of course, the Spectre Street estate, and it's not a black community as such in the short story either. The way they respond to the tragedies that have occurred, of course, in the short story, the baby is murdered. It's actually really horrific. It's absolutely horrific. And the way Barker describes the people of Spectre Street responding to that is as though it's almost like a carnival. They take it as funny.
One of the things that it reminded me of, in a sort of oblique way, is Orwell's The Road to Wigan Pier, because Orwell portrays the working class people of those communities that he visits. This is in the 1930s. He portrays them with enormous sympathy, but he portrays them with a kind of brutal honesty. You know, he doesn't shy away from the fact that these are people who are very different to the kinds of people that his presumed readership, middle class literary people in London and so on, are accustomed to dealing with. And Orwell, of course, has come under a great deal of criticism for the way he portrays people in mining communities in that book over the years, both at the time and over the years since. But I can't help but admire Orwell's determination to be honest about exactly who these people are and what they're like and stuff like that. And there's something similar to that in The Forbidden. There
absolutely is. I mean, you have to bear in mind, Barker comes from that's where he was at the time. In fact, he was even below that particular strata at the time of writing. He was beyond underclass. He was out. There was he had nothing, you know.
I couldn't find anything in the story that spoke to me of sort of malevolent politics or
no.
It's
not that. It is
nasty right wing.
No,
explanation.
It is not that.
It's just a brutal honesty.
Yeah, it's just Barker being honest about the way he is perceiving humanity at the time.
How people live in those places, how they have to live in those places.
But that comes back to the point you made earlier, Jack, about this apparatus. If the apparatus, or if you like, the middle class lens of things is all pervasive, because the middle class gets the chance to reproduce its culture more than anyone else, then it's well, you've portrayed these people as no. You're seeing that through the very lens that you erect around everything, and therefore it's like no, you're blaming the wrong person. It's not about Orwell patronizing these people any more than Barker, or making them into grotesques or something.
With regards to The Forbidden, you have to bear in mind that he is portraying everything through the perspectives of an essentially middle class white woman, which is Helen.
What I love about Helen in the story is that she has an enormous amount of self-awareness.
She's more interior, isn't she? She's far more interior than the one in the film.
As she's doing it, she's kind of acknowledging to herself that she's doing something that's appropriative and intrusive, and that she doesn't really belong there, and that she can't really understand this from the outside looking in. She knows all that. The interesting thing is that knowing it doesn't really help. Knowing all that doesn't change her behavior. She still does what she's doing, even though she knows all this.
And it's one of the things, I must admit, in the film that I was saying earlier about strangely, I wasn't completely sort of. I mean, I'm better with horror films now than when I was younger. But
while doing this series, you'd have to be.
But I'm not sort of completely bamboozled by the imagery, because actually the thing I found most frightening about the film in a way was not its quote unquote supernatural element, because I do absolutely buy this idea that this is about story rather than a traditional ghost. The thing I found perhaps most harrowing about the film was how quickly Helen, being a woman, basically, and it pretty much predicated on that, could have her life absolutely railroaded by the institutions and the people around her for simply just not following the correct course. how quickly it happens, and how I mean, that was the harrowing part.
Yeah.
The remark about, well, you've been sedated on and off for what, a month?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a terrifying line.
Yeah.
It's like, what? And the image of the straps, knowing you can't move, in a way, even before Tony Todd returns and is levitating in a rather good practical effect, actually, simple but really effective. It's great. Those things of I've ended up here so fast.
Yeah, and Candyman aside, of course,
because of judiciary,
you get the impression that could have happened anyway. As there is it's more implied in the film, but her relationship with Trevor isn't very stable or particularly good. In the book, it's absolutely overt. In the short story, it's overt. Trevor is an absolute total patriarchal prick in the short story, and is a postmodern contrarian who just picks fights for the sake of his own narcissism and ego.
And it's absolutely clear in the story, of course, that she used to be his student, which is implied.
Which is implied in the film. Yeah. Which, of course, I mean that lays in a lovely little wrinkle with regards to the way she perceives his new bit on the side, of course.
Yeah. Because she knows how he operates, because she used to be that girl. Yeah.
It's as above, so below. Everything cycles. Everything cycles.
You can sort of read her obsession with Cabrini Green as a way of trying to escape from that. She's trying to establish herself as a serious academic with who can, maybe even a writer. Maybe she's going to write a book about this, about the graffiti and the symbols and the myths and the cycles that occur within these communities, and that will be her way out of this.
And that's another frightening image.
But that moment of, sorry,
no, I was saying it's another frightening image is because you have this woman. Regardless of where it takes us in terms of the arrogance of the colonialist, as we said earlier, is she's trying to seize her narrative, and she seizes her narrative through her gaze. So it's her white woman's gaze on a black neighborhood, but it's in a way her trying to seize a narrative with the stills camera and so on, and then undercutting it. She realizes that she's been watched all the time, whilst her gaze has been under presumably her own agency, so she thinks, and then you see that fantastic image of him behind her. I mean, that's one of the most frightening sequences in the film. So it's that this film has its cake and eats it. It presents you with the jump scare, the hook pushing through the back of the mirror, the sudden moment of gore, the bees scene, but it's actually little moments like that. You've been sedated for a month. There was this person watching all the time, and I think the absolute coup of making a wide open space, because we tend to associate enclosed spaces, claustrophobia, with heightened senses of fear and, of course, darkness. A men's loo, a men's toilet, public toilet in the middle of the day in a wide open space where you've got loads of places to run suddenly becomes the most frightening thing on earth.
Yeah, it's very clever. It's very clever. I mean, don't you guys love as well? I mean, just taking it aside for the moment, the seductive nature of the way the Candyman speaks to her. His seduction, I mean, I think it's beautiful. Come with me and be rumor. Come with me and be a story, be immortal.
And yet there's also a really genuinely sad element to that, which is, of course, we know from the story of Daniel, as we know from our history, that because we've seen so many pictures, photographs of black victims of racial violence or lynching, and their and in this with Daniel, his entire life, this man who was an artist who was going to presumably, if he could, marry this woman, and it's reduced down to photo stories, mural, film, paintings, as so many black victims have been. We're familiar with the photographic images of their dead or mutilated bodies.
Yeah,
but nothing else. So even though it is powerful, there's a real sadness underpinning it, because it's because he's all you are made into.
He's a victim, right?
Yeah,
he's ultimately a victim of the same vicious, grinding engines of history.
Well, he is the predatory story, but he's not the predatory story by choice. No. He is what he's written to be.
Exactly.
I think his attempt to seduce her or entice her or whatever, And I think it's sincere. I think if you want to speak in these terms about him, and it's impossible to pin down what kind of entity he is. I think he is an entity. I don't think he's just a figment of Helen's imagination. There is a supernatural agency at work in this film. But it's like if stories become so concentrated, if meaning becomes so concentrated, it kind of takes on a sort of material reality,
like an animus.
The semiotic density is so much that reality sort of collapses around it and turns into that. He's something like that. He can only be what he's written to be. He can only be the predator, the killer that he's written to be, and he doesn't necessarily want to be that, but he just is. And in the end, it's kind of proved at the end, because there can be only one of them. This dream that he has of sort of the two of them together, that's not going to work. And it turns out that he's the one that has to go.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I love the ending. I love the ending of the Candyman, because it's not necessarily the fire, is it? It's the fact that the people they've written an ending for that story. And that's the way it ends.
Yes, they feel and they think that that's the end of him. So it is, because he is nothing. Yeah. He is nothing but their story. So if they think that putting him in if they think that putting him in the bonfire, and if they think that'll put an end to him, then of course it will, because they're the ones writing the story.
Exactly. With regards to the bonfire, what do we think of that, by the way? Because in the short story, the reason the bonfire exists, obviously, is because it's set in England and it's nearly bonfire night.
Bonfire night, yeah.
Which, of course, is another myth.
So that means that the short story takes place in that little zone of time between Halloween and Bonfire Night, which is my favorite. It's my favorite part of the year.
Yeah,
me too.
It's of course,
and of course it has freight within the mythology and metaphysics of the story, because it is that time when stories become active and become real, right?
Yes. But the bonfire has an ancient history. People have had bonfires to celebrate and to mark time and to have communal gatherings and so on for as long as there have been people. One of the reasons we associate the bonfire in Britain so much with Guy Fawkes and Bonfire Night, really because of an accident of history, because the gunpowder plotters, they were planning to blow up Parliament much earlier than the beginning of November, and they kept on having to put the plot off for one reason or another. So it's really only by pure coincidence that they tried to do it and got caught. On the 5th of November, at the time of year when, in accordance with ancient practices going back thousands of years, loads of people across the country were having bonfires.
Right?
And of course, what that turned into, bonfires lit to celebrate the deliverance of the king. That was the official reason, anyway. And it just became sort of, again, it's a semiotic density. It became semiotically linked, that moment in time and the bonfire and the idea of the plot, the gunpowder plot, with all its political with its contradictory political valences and its gothic undertone and so on, and its implications of divergent historical paths, could have gone one way, could have gone the other, and it all just became linked. So we in this country have that incredible semiotic link around the late autumn and the bonfire and all this stuff, and in America it's interesting, but it feels very organic nonetheless, because it feels like the kind of thing that would almost be suggested as a cultural practice by the space in which they're living, because Cabrini Green, and again you mentioned earlier, Elliot, the wonderful aerial shots. We're told from the very start that it actually has these gigantic open communal spaces between the beehive housing blocks. So it feels like the sort of thing that, just if you had like waste ground, open communal waste ground between these centers of population,
how would you utilize it?
And the bonfire is made of sort of people's junk, and people do generate junk. It just feels like the kind of thing that would happen organically. People would do that. People do that.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that occurred to me as well, just changing tack slightly, is that Dracula is a big deal for this film as well. In fact, in a way, the film makes explicit the racism of Dracula to make a point in it.
That's great. Yeah, I hadn't really thought of that, but the minute you said it, I thought, wouldn't Tony Todd make an amazing Dracula?
Oh my God!
If you had a colorblind casting version.
Whoa! I'd love to see that. Jeez, that'd be amazing.
And even the kind of analog to Mina that with Helen willingly succumbing and then trying not to, and then there were various. But I thought, well, this is making explicit for a strong political reason things that are implicit in Dracula that just come out of actual racism.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that may actually be again derived from the original short story, because Barker is an enormous fan, by his own admission, of the garrulous and loquacious monster, the monster that is a bit of a chatty Cathy. So Dracula, obviously, one of his favorites. Frankenstein's monster, obviously, again, one of his favorites. Another huge influence on this, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the idea of, it's almost locked into the idea, of having a community at the end and things on fire. I mean, that evokes, James Whale's Frankenstein and things like that. But certainly those aerial shots as well, they're fascinating, because they set up a kind of a crackle, because is this the all-seeing eye of Candyman, or is this do these fulfill another function altogether, which is the fragility of the human beings and the weight of the history of Chicago and so on. And again, it's like so many things in the film, you get just in reach of them and they just slip away from you. Yeah. But that runs throughout the film, so then you're in the region of intention, which makes it so much more interesting.
Kind of gets us back towards something that I was going to say earlier when we were talking about this, because the aerial shots strongly suggested, like, I felt like it was very urgent for the film to communicate to us the architecture and the feel of the space and the levels in Cabrini Green. And then it does show us the Chicago skyline. It goes out of its way to do that as well. So we're being very definitely given contrasting ideas of physical, social, communal space in Chicago. There's very definitely there's a world of us and there's a world of them. Basically, that's what it's doing.
And the old Sears Tower has horns on it.
Yeah, of course. Well, great black monolith.
Yeah, it's just emphasizing that almost Gothic theme that the story has with regards to architecture, as well as architecture as an expression of mythology and of history.
It's one of those great ironies that architecture that became sort of the archetypal corporate visual signature, the flat square mirror windowed tower block just became the signature of corporate power in America. And it comes from the international style. It comes from utopian radical modernism, Mies van der Rohe, Le Corbusier, stuff like that. And so does
then you delve into the politics of people like Mies van der Rohe, and it's like, oh right, okay.
In terms of its family lineage, so does Cabrini Green. Cabrini Green, in its own way, it's kind of a rational modernist box of straight lines that's designed rationally for human life, etc., for this idea that you can engineer human lives and human consciousness and so on through rational environments and so on. And it shows us those both, and it's in Chicago, so the idea of levels becomes very important, because you see on the levels that rise up into the sky, and then you get very, very definitely shown, especially through the aerial shots, you get very clearly shown that Cabrini Green is down on the ground. It's it's very down to the ground. Cabrini Green. It's at a very low level, and historically in Chicago was like in that part of the country, it was the center of the slaughter, the beef and pork slaughter industry, and they didn't have proper sewage when it started. So in the 1800s. The streets of Chicago were just awash in blood. The streets were just blood. And they started building so high because people wanted to live as high up as possible, live and work as high up as possible away from the streets, because the streets were literally just the Chicago streets and streets of it was just literally just wading through blood, the blood from slaughterhouses.
Wow.
And you can imagine, of course, what happened.
Locate horror stories in this.
You can imagine what happened, of course. Social class and, of course, therefore, particularly in America, race became stratified, not just in terms of social space, but in terms of actual literal architectural space. If you were black, if you were poor, you lived lower down in the mud.
Yeah, of course. Wow.
And, of course, yeah, I mean, and wow, does this film not pull away from the idea of waste and feces. Jeez.
Isn't it amazing? I mean, like, this film, it does, when people tend to look at it these days, it tends to be in a very sort of glib and very superficial way. They look at it in terms of, horror movie icons. So they look at the Candyman and they equate him with things like Freddy Krueger and with Michael Myers and whatnot. But this is of another order of magnitude.
Completely different level of filmmaking. Yeah, I'm afraid. Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. I mean, one of the just on a very superficial level, one of the things of watching this film for the first time the other night was I'd always said, "Oh, Elm Street has got such a great idea," and I've never been satisfied with the way the films have their moments. They particularly the early ones. But even so, it's like they never quite got the execution on that amazing idea, and this is the one. I mean, it's not the exact same concept, but the premise is similar.
It's similar enough.
This is what I was looking for. This is what it was, and I never knew it was there.
Yeah, and you'd avoided it for the last how many years?
Well, I mean, the avoiding was only in the for a short time. Then it was just I just forgot. I mean, it's almost worse, really, isn't it?
Have either of you seen the more recent one?
No.
I haven't got around to it yet. I want to.
It's very interesting. It's very interesting. It's actually a very different film from this. It's a very different film. It is from the perspective. I mean, it's what a lot of the black academics have been crying out for with regards to this film, which is a version of the Candyman, which is about black people. And told from the perspective of black creators. And in that regard, it's very, very interesting. It is at times too glib and too aware of itself as a piece of media and sort of auto-analyzes in that regard. So you do have characters sitting around talking about the themes quite a lot.
Our old bugbear.
But given that, it's actually not bad. It's not a bad film at all. It's certainly, it maintains that wonderful ambiguity that this film has with regards to exactly what the Candyman is. Because in the new film, the Candyman can be anything and anyone. From within that culture, whoever perpetuates the myth, whoever perpetuates the cycle, may as well be the Candyman. It's very interesting. It's not perfect. In comparison to this film, doesn't stand up massively well, but worth a watch.
Well, it's definitely on the list. I'll get to it. I definitely will. I still have to catch the remake of Suspiria as well, which
I loved that.
Yes, me as well.
I loved it
because I love the original.
Absolutely shocked. Yes. I avoided that. I deliberately avoided that for the longest time because I'm like, my whole response to it was how.
Yeah.
How
and why?
can you do that? And why? Why would you do that? And someone I trust quite a lot said, no, watch it. It's actually a very good film.
We're in very much the same case because I've kind of been curious about it. It's on the list of things I need to get to, but I've also obviously almost unconsciously been avoiding it because I feel I'm so attached to the original Suspiria. It's such a huge film for me. But I've also had people I respect tell me I need to watch it. So,
It's so good. It's so good. What it does is it takes the base premise and ideas and then does its own thing.
Well, that's
its
great.
Own thing, and it is fantastic. I was mesmerized by that film. Absolutely mesmerized. It's a beautiful horror film. Absolutely beautiful.
I literally had the best response recently from regarding the original, and that if a few of us get together for the occasional film night, and everyone gets a choice of film, and it was my friend Kirsty's choice, and she said, "Oh, I want to watch the original Suspiria," and I went, "Oh, great!"
Good for her.
And her partner went, "Oh, I've never seen that."
Oh,
and so it was his reaction. It was his face at the end of the film was absolutely priceless, because he looked completely done in, like he'd been smashed through a wall, and he looked at me and went, What was that? And I was like, oh yeah, of course, I'm used to this film in a way. You know, I sort of know the bit, so I'm watching it in a completely different context in my head. And he looked completely like pulled through a hedge backwards. He said, I don't know what I've just watched. I've got nothing. He said, I don't even know. I can't even give you a sort of, I really like that, or I didn't like that. I don't know how I feel.
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a superior.
Back to the car.
That's a superior, all right.
And of course you forget that, because we're familiar with them, and it's like you have to sort of do that. What was my first reaction? Whereas at least with the Candyman, and the first reaction, Candyman's going to hang around for a while.
But wow, guys! I mean, this is one I would happily speak about again and again and again and again. I think it is one of the most brilliant, complex, rich horror films ever made.
Well, Jack can give himself a pat on the back, because he said, I can't imagine you won't like, and he was absolutely right.
I think of all the ones we're doing, actually, this may be the most complex to talk about.
It's towering as a movie, and I think even its points where, and we've discussed it, where we go, oh, that could be. It's so serious about what it's trying to do.
Yeah, it's earnest, isn't it? This is not like laden with irony or whatever.
These things don't come out of laziness, or they don't come out of ineptitude. They come out of it's a serious endeavor, and therefore, if things don't quite land, it's not through any lapse. It's it's tried to see something through to a conclusion. So it's very admirable in that respect. I mean,
and everyone involved is doing that. Like everyone involved, from the cameraman to the director, the music, the art design, everything is taking this seriously.
Mm-hmm. And I've got such an appreciation for that, because, as I said, there is a tendency, this genre gets the short end of the stick. So very often, certainly.
And at that time, 1992, what state was horror in? Like, mainstream?
You can literally imagine the dinner party in Upper East Side Manhattan, when Philip Glass says, "Oh yeah, I'm doing a score for a horror movie," and everyone going, "Oh God, he's short of cash, Phil."
Yeah.
Whoever else involved in that film, it's like, what? Why? You can hear those dinner party conversations, but I love it when a genre that gets short shrift, like the ones we tend to have a lot of time for, get seriously good craft, on them from people like this.
And I love the fact that it was mainstream as well. I mean, this hit hard. This film did well. It hit hard. It got great audiences.
Yeah, I mean, because I watched it with Vicky, who did remember it. She said, "Oh, I remember watching it." She was surprised that I hadn't seen it. She said, "How did you not watch it?" Exactly like you guys. How did you not see this? And so I had, but she said, "Oh, yeah." She said it was very traumatizing watching this as a teenage girl. She said, and it was quite interesting, because obviously I had nothing really to go on, and we were just getting. I was getting the DVD ready. She was like, "I'm taking a run up at this," and I went, "Are you sure you want to?" She said, "No, let's watch it, but I'm taking a run up."
Well, I must admit, I do have a sentimental memory attached to this one, because again, 1992, I was a kid. I was absolutely a kid, and I remember my mum going to the cinema to see it, and then coming back and telling me about it. And I was like, "Oh, that sounds brilliant! That sounds amazing."
I'm pretty sure I saw this at the cinema. Actually, I'm not entirely sure, because I either saw it at the cinema and then rented it as soon as it was available to rent on VHS, or I just saw it as soon as it was available on VHS. I can't quite remember, because I definitely remember that I saw Alien 3 in the cinemas. I think I saw this at the cinema as well.
I envy that. I absolutely envy that. I mean, it would have definitely been a VHS rental for me.
Again, I was only just old enough. I was 16 in the summer of '92, so I wouldn't have quite been legally old enough.
You were sneaking in.
Into this and Alien 3, actually. But
I was sort of doubly jealous of that because, firstly, I would have been too young, but secondly, I was always very jealous because I could never get away with that. Because I always looked too young for my age. It took me ages to mature, in that sense. I mean, maturity hasn't come in many other senses. But it's like, I used to have friends who could get into films because they just looked so much more great. And it really used to piss me off.
Me too. I had to actually wait to see my first horror film at the cinema until I was legally old enough to do so, which was annoying.
I don't think I needed to first properly shave until I was in my mid-20s, This is how annoying this is.
Oh wow! Although to be fair, my first horror film was The Blair Witch Project at the cinema, so it's like, that's awesome, right? That's brilliant.
That's a good start.
The second one, unfortunately, was The Sixth Sense, which I fucking hated and still fucking hate.
Well, that just continues to show good taste.
But no, guys, I mean, wow, it's going to be hard to top. It's going to be hard.
I don't know what's next, actually.
What is next, by the way, guys? Are we doing? Just going down the list? What's the next one?
I think the plan was Hereditary.
Oh, right. Yes.
Ooh. Well, that's good to follow. That's good to follow.
I say this might be, that could do it. Wow, Jesus.
Because I was late to that one, not as late as this, but I kept taking run-ups to that. But wow, what a film!
But I feel like somewhere along the line we also decided that we were going to do In the Mouth of Madness.
Yes.
So I don't know.
That I am looking forward to.
Shall we do that next and then top it off with Hereditary?
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah,
shall we
do that?
Yeah,
because
I like that.
It's a leavening agent. I mean, In the Mouth of Madness is great, but it's a lot funnier than these two films. It's got more of a sense of like levity about it, despite it being about like a Lovecraftian apocalypse. So, shall we do that one next?
Sounds cracking.
I think that's
great. Yeah. Also, it will give me a good excuse to watch it again.
I love it because my copy of In the Mouth of Madness, I've actually got to. It's here on the shelf. It's got the fantastic title of "En la boca del miedo" because I've got an import.
Oh man! I mean, do you read Sutter Kane?
So I am looking forward to that.
I mean, what the fuck's going on? Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. We'll get to it. It's just utterly, and Sam Neill, of course, being brilliant.
Yeah,
just being Sam Neill.
There is a kind of connection as well because I mean we were talking about Candyman
David Warner's in it.
That's true. David Warner's in it. Yeah, the great David Warner. Yeah. But we were talking about Candyman being about predatory stories and stories.
Wow.
Legends and myths, things that are written, fictions becoming real, bleeding into the real world, taking over. That's exactly what In the Mouth of Madness is about.
It's all there.
We planned this. We planned this thematic.
Absolutely, we did. It's just, I mean, I keep cycling over the silly, funny lines from In the Mouth of Madness in my head. Oh no, not Carpenters 2. I'm sorry about the balls. It was a lucky shot.
Oh no, this is a film I do know, but that I haven't actually seen it for years, but it's one I do know quite well. But I've probably had about 10-12 years since I've seen this.
It's a lot of fun for a film that's as nihilistic as it is, and it bloody is. It is a 1990s nihilism, though. It's like it is like a Nirvana track,
Yeah, it's like a Sam Bayer music video.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. But I just love it. It is so much fun. I wish I could see it at the cinema. I want to go to a screening of it because I think it would be great with an audience.
That thing about how, of course, certain periods kind of crystallize you in some way, because it was one of the things about watching Candyman, even though I had not seen it originally. It's the same hit off things like Paper House or anything else that we watched in that. There's a sort of magical period for me, and it's sort of like maybe 87 to about 93 where there's a particular feeling and vibe and look to films which crosses that period where I'm coming out of childhood and going into adolescence. So, and this had it. And it's like,
of course.
There's something about the stock of the film. There's something about everything about this. It's just,
and of course, there's something about you as well. During that transitional period, there's something about you and the way you experience media and the way your brain absorbs it.
So in a strange way, I was seeing this for the first time at 40, but at the same time, all that plunged me back. So it was almost like watching it as a 12, 13-year-old at the same time. It was that extraordinary hit I got off it, because I've got the culture, the pop culture from around that time. And suddenly there was this piece of pop culture from around that time that I didn't see until Saturday. So the hit off it was really palpable. It's
kind of heady, yeah.
It's like, I know this, but I don't. And that disconnect was, even before I got into the story, before I was, drawn into the content, just that hit was it was like, wow, here is a piece that this feels recognizable and completely alien at once.
Yeah, it's like
when a nice vibe.
When you listen to an album from an artist you really liked back in the day that somehow back in the day you missed, it's like going back. Certainly, I had those vibes with Candyman, because, as I say, I watched it at the time quite a few times, But with In the Mouth of Madness, that is really going to transport me back. I think
that is
Candyman's a bit. It's a bit too American to be as evocative for me, whereas In the Mouth of Madness is American too, but I don't know. There's just something about In the Mouth of Madness that's absolutely going to transport me right the way back to.
I would say it's as 90s Carpenter as Prince of Darkness is 80s. It's
95, isn't it?
Right?
Yeah, 95.
Smack in the middle.
My absolute mid-teens. So,
and it also, it's the last of the Apocalypse trilogy, of course.
It is,
Apocalypse trilogy, the Lovecraftian one.
Yeah,
brilliant. Well, we'll do that then, guys. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Before we go, is there anything that you guys would like to pimp out?
Jack, go ahead.
Well, me? Oh, okay. If you want to go to my Blue Sky, I'm at Times Carcass at blah, 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 whatever the Blue Sky handle is.
Links below.
Links below, yeah. And I've got a Patreon. Give me $1 a month. You'll get access to everything, which will mean advance access to these recordings, advance access to anything I write. And I have actually got some things on the boil at the moment. Advance access to... I create audiobooks at the moment. I'm creating audiobooks of political texts that I find interesting, and also short stories, generally ghost stories at this time.
They're on your YouTube channel, aren't they, Jack?
And I put them up at my YouTube channel, but my patrons get them a week or so in advance as audio files. So if that tickles your fancy, just $1 a month, as I say, access to everything. I blog at Eruditorium Press, and of course there's I Don't Speak German, which is my main big project, still on hiatus, but coming back. And that's about white nationalists. So if you want to take your mind off, imaginary horrors and dwell in the genuine sort of swamp of misery that is outside in the real world, then I have a podcast for you. Why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you?
Links below, guys. Links below.
The only thing I can pimp out, really, it would make sense to people who are either in or around the city of Bristol, because I'm currently part of a yearly project, which is probably germane to our podcast in some ways, because they're a company called Red Rope Theatre, who do a Gothic play every year. They've done it for many years. It's got a real sort of cult following now, and they've done Liz Lockhead's Dracula. I did that many years ago. They've done Frankenstein, Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Turn of the Screw, Christmas Carol. And this year is the turn of The Hound of the Baskervilles. And I'm doing my very first stage role in 5 years. And don't laugh at the bat, but I am playing Sherlock Holmes.
Yes.
I thought I was too young, but he's only 35 in the Hound of the Baskervilles novella, and I have sailed past 35. So if you're in the Bristol or surrounding area, or you're just completely mad and you want to jump on your private jet, where it's a short run, because it is for the Halloween season, or just after 15th of November to early December. at the wonderful, wonderful Anglican chapel at the Arnos Vale Cemetery in Bristol, which is just the most fantastic site. They do films there, they do all sorts of things, and as I say, they have this play, they have this production company in every year to do a play. It's great fun, and that will be up and running, as I say, 15th of November. So it is after Halloween, but that was the slot we had to get.
Excellent. If there are any sort of online, access to this at all, Ellie, chuck me a link and I'll put it in the
redropetheatre.co.uk is their all one word, redropetheatre.co.uk, and it's the first image you'll see is the poster. It's good fun, and it is a straight rendering. I know over the years it's tended to be done as pastiche or parody, but this is an absolutely down the line, shit your pants, straight.
Excellent
performance. I don't know. The jury's still out on that.
I want to just a little bit of backstage stuff here. When Elliot was first approached about this, he told us about it in a WhatsApp group that he and I are both in with a couple of other people, and he was like, "Yeah, I've been asked to come in and audition for Sherlock Holmes," and he was like, "I'm not sure if I really want," and everybody else in the group was immediately, what? Of course you have to do it. You have to do it.
It sounds like a total diva, but because I haven't been on the stage in 5 years, I mean, I've mostly been producing and narrating audiobooks, and of course, because of things like COVID, the theatres were shut, and I haven't done television in years. I haven't got the face for telly, so I thought, going back to the theatre after so long, I don't know. But then it was like, it's local. I get to go home every night. It's a short run, and my God, it's Sherlock Holmes. Am I mad? But I kept telling myself, I'm completely wrong for this part. I'm completely wrong for this. And I went to the audition with the thing of, it'll just be nice to do the audition because I don't think I'm right for this. So it was a little bit of a shocker when they said, we quite liked your version. Do you want to do it? But we'll see. Stand by with rotten fruit.
Excellent stuff. Links below, guys. As for myself, you can find me here on Exaggerated Elegy, where there are lots more chats like this. There are various video game let's play, and whatever I fancy doing. That's what Exaggerated Elegy is. It's kind of a dump for all the stuff that I like to do. So you'll find more of me waffling around here. If you go over to arrowfilms.com, you will find the new Hellraiser Blu-ray set is now out. And it's landing.
He's on it.
People have got it. It's landing on people's doorsteps as we speak. And myself and our mutual colleague Kit Power, we're on the Hellbound disc on the featurette. Hell is What They Wanted. Links to all of my short story collections and published work over at strangeplaygrounds.com, or if you want to go to the Evil Empire of Amazon and type in my name, George Daniel Lee, you'll find my author page. And beyond that, I am still on Twitter for as long as that lasts. Let's see, shall we? I mean, who knows? At this rate, I mean, Elon might just decide, like, it works better if it doesn't work, or if it's all black and you can't see any text or whatever. Or what about...
That would be better.
That might be better, actually. What about a Twitter where people can't tweet? Why not? That's avant-garde, isn't it? And you can also find me at Blue Sky as well. Links to all of that down there below. Guys, thank you so much. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. That was a great chat. When we come back in the Mouth of Madness, guys, until then, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Watch Candyman.